Welcome, everyone. As you know, I'm not Peter Loewen. My name is Mel Kapp. I'm a distinguished fellow in the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Peter is unfortunately struck down with the flu, and my guess is he's watching online to make sure I don't screw up. This is a speaker in the David Peterson Leadership Speaker Series. And we have had several distinguished visitors who've given a talk in that series. And I just want to thank David and Shelley Peterson for their support to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. After Mr. Fast speaks, we'll pass around cards. You can put your questions down on paper. I will pose them and integrate them and ask some of my own questions to Mr. Fast. And those of you online can put your questions in through the online app, and we'll be collecting them here as well. So let me tell you about Ed Fast. You know, how do you measure success? As a professor, I mark papers indiscriminately and give out marks. I see some of my students smirking. How you measure success if you're a politician is whether you win elections or not. And Ed Fast has won 6. So the people of Abbotsford, BC, obviously have confidence in Mr. Fast. In the Stephen Harper government, he was Minister of International Trade and has a list of accomplishments which are quite distinctive. He published the Global Markets Action Plan in that government. He has a number of free trade agreements under his belt. He was responsible for bringing to fruition the European Union trade agreement, the Comprehensive and Economic Trade Agreement with the EU, a trade agreement with South Korea, a trade agreement with Ukraine, which is of no small consequence. And he was the original negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which ultimately was culminated by the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership that was finalized after he left office. He was also responsible for modernizing existing free trade agreements with Israel and with Chile. I will tell you that Mr. Fast has been vicariously in my classroom in the master's program when 2 weeks ago we were discussing medical assistance in dying as it applies to people with mental disorders, and the next day he had tabled a private member's bill to stop the application of MAID in those circumstances. And then this week, in our class on globalization, a question was put on what should Canada do to prepare for the possibility of a Trump government in the United States. And today we'll find out what we should be doing in preparation for trade in the era of Trump. Please join me in welcoming Ed Fast.
Well, thank you so much, Mel, for that introduction. And you've covered some of my materials, so you've stolen my thunder. But I'm delighted to be here to share a few thoughts about the state of global trade. Most of you don't know that the U of T is actually my father's alma mater. I believe he graduated in 1954. His son never made it back here. I got stuck at UBC and finished all of my education there as a lawyer. Now, I know my MP colleague and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Melanie Joly, was with you almost a year ago and painted a rather rosy picture of Canada's place in the world and our government's plans for the future. Now, my remarks are intended to be a respectful counterpoint to that narrative, and perhaps also a sobering reevaluation of the state of play in which Canada finds itself. And I do want to thank my friend Jonathan Fried for his valuable contribution to tonight's presentation. As was mentioned, I've been a member of Parliament for many years, for 18 years, and certainly the highlight of my career was serving as Canada's Minister of International Trade. As you might expect, I was the most traveled minister in the Harper government and often traveled with the Prime Minister. And during those travels, I met many of the world's top leaders and observed their different leadership styles. Merkel, Modi, Obama, Xi, Putin, Netanyahu, each leader rose to the top and governed based on a different paradigm. Some succeeded through brute force, others by cunning, and still others using charm. There was even the occasional servant leader. But beyond my travels, our trade team was busy expanding opportunities for our trade-oriented businesses to do better, to have open markets through free trade agreements, foreign investment, promotion and protection agreements, or FIPAs as they're called. Today, whether it's trade in goods and services or investment attraction and protection, we're just beginning to reap the benefits of expanded access to those trade and investment opportunities. Now, I'm from British Columbia, as I mentioned. One thing you quickly learn in my home province is the importance of trade. We're Canada's gateway to the dynamic Asia-Pacific region, representing a huge opportunity to grow Canada's prosperity if we can only get our ducks in order. Canada's affordability and prosperity depend on supply chains being able to rely on efficient transportation and logistics infrastructure. And that's why the former Conservative government set aside $1 billion in funding for an aggressive Asia-Pacific Gateway infrastructure strategy that expanded and improved our marine and inland ports and upgraded our rail, bridge, and road systems. So the goal was to improve our ability to get our exports out to markets and our imports in the most cost-efficient way, because we wanted to maintain our West Coast competitive advantage over other ports on the West Coast of North America. Now that job, that infrastructure investment job, remains unfinished, and additional public and private investment is required, especially when it comes to disaster mitigation and resiliency. Now, as an aside, I would be remiss if I didn't also mention the critical importance of streamlining Canada's regulatory environment to eliminate the red tape and gridlock that exists within our development approval process. But beyond infrastructure and regulatory reform, the most important element in improving our competitiveness within the global marketplace is to allow our trade-oriented businesses to operate within a framework of globalized trade that adheres to a clear set of rules that reduces and eliminates tariff and non-tariff barriers. Now that may be through the negotiation of bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements with our key partners around the world. It may also be by striking investment protection treaties to improve Canada's foreign investment environment here at home and protect Canadian investors abroad. Lastly, it means that we must be a trusted and respected voice at multilateral organizations like the World Trade Organization and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And therein lies the rub. Without trusted relationships with our most important trade partners, without the requisite credibility at trade fora such as the WTO or OECD, it is difficult, if not impossible, to negotiate the kinds of agreements and accommodations necessary to improve our ability to trade freely with the rest of the world. So let me start where we were and then move on to the current state of play. No matter what you think of the former Harper government, there's no disputing that it placed a very special focus on trade. In fact, Stephen Harper made trade expansion the linchpin of his economic policy. By offering a strong, stable record of economic management at home, along with an unprecedented list of trade accomplishments, the Harper government helped shape the conditions that would lead to a significant increase in Canada's exports to the rest of the world. It all began with the Global Markets Action Plan. Thanks for mentioning that, Mel. We called it GMAP. And this was our overarching plan under which all of our trade and investment activities would take place. GMAP outlined very clear goals that were designed to maximize economic benefits for Canadian workers and businesses. It included a commitment to provide preferential market access for Canadian businesses around the world and a commitment to protect Canadian investments abroad. The plan also called for us to significantly expand our export support programs and economic diplomacy, recognizing that optimal trade outcomes require enhanced trade promotion. Our Trade Commissioner service was rapidly expanded by opening many new offices in dynamic regions of the world, including China and India. Export Development Canada and similar agencies were harnessed to provide specialized financing and promotional support to our exporters. Of course, the showpiece of GMAP was a robust trade and negotiation policy, primarily focused on FTAs and FIPAs. Now, as a baseline, in 2006, Canada had exactly 5 free trade agreements, actually had agreements, trade agreements with 5 countries. That would have been US, Mexico, Costa Rica, Israel, and Chile. By 2015, some 9 years later, Canada had negotiated free trade agreements with an additional 46 countries, including the 27 countries of the European Union, South Korea, Ukraine, Jordan, the 4 countries of EFTA, which are Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Iceland, and Norway, and the 11 partners of the TPP, including Japan, which later on morphed into the CPTPP. There were also modernized FTAs with Israel, and as you mentioned, Chile, and a host of new FIPAs, including one with China, which took 18 years to conclude. Of our new FTAs, arguably the most noteworthy is the Canada-European Union one, CETA as it's called, which opened up a market of over 500 million consumers. And this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get a leg up on other countries, with Canada now being the only G7 country to have free trade agreements with the entire European Union and the rest of the G7. And this means that Canadian businesses have a competitive advantage with free trade access to more than half of the entire global marketplace, some 1.5 billion consumers. Now, interestingly, the US and the EU don't have their own free trade agreement with each other, representing a tremendous head start for our businesses if they would only seize the opportunity. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention softwood lumber. As some of you know, by 2006, this outstanding irritant had resulted in billions of dollars in punitive and illegal duties being collected by our American friends. The signing of the Softwood Lumber Agreement, led by then Trade Minister David Emerson, ushered in 10 years of peace in the woods and the return of several billions of dollars to our lumber producers. Now, in 2015, the Harper government's last year in office, for the very first time in our history, Canada's two-way trade with the world topped $1 trillion. Today, it's actually much, much more. With all of our market advantages, our goods and services trade has hit almost $2 trillion. Now, that didn't happen by accident. It happened because our government believed international trade and investment are the key drivers of Canada's economic growth and will continue to be so in the years to come. Modern trade agreements like the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement, CETA, and the CPTPP have put in place the right conditions for exporters of goods and services to succeed. And with robust yet respectful trade relations came better diplomatic relationships. And these trusted relationships allowed us to play an outsized role in helping free trade partners like Peru and Colombia emerge from troubled histories to build stronger institutional capacity in areas such as justice, law enforcement, and human rights. Canada, acting as a trusted middle power, exercising soft power for the benefit of others, exactly what our country was known for. But have we continued to build on our success over the last decade or so, or even over the past year? By any objective measure, the answer has to be no. Principled foreign policy, values-based diplomacy, whatever the guise, whatever the premise, it hasn't gone as planned. The erosion of our relationships with some of the most dynamic economies in the world, China, India, Saudi Arabia, Philippines, and even the United States, is very worrisome. Rather than forging and sustaining positive, lasting alliances that support Canada's economic interests, Canada has been clumsy on the world stage, not taken seriously by world leaders, and increasingly relegated to the kids' table by our allies. We've reneged on our defense commitments, losing face with our NATO allies, including our most trusted and important ally, the United States. And as former Ambassador Louise Blais wrote in Policy Options, quote, "Everyone in the know, including global affairs insiders, acknowledges Canada has largely lost its influence on the world stage," end quote. My former colleague and Finance Minister Joe Oliver put it this way: the reasons for this loss of influence include trumpeting our values and then tying them to international assistance programs, failing to adapt pragmatically to a changing world, eroding our foreign policy expertise, and weakening our military. Even former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney has lamented that Canada's international influence is waning at a time when its diplomatic relationships with China and India are at a low ebb. The rest of the world appears to be ignoring Canada, and they don't have much time for our opinions, he said, and that leaves us without influence, end quote. Now, one of the reasons for this diminished status on the global stage is, in my judgment, the current government's strategic mistake of viewing trade not primarily as a means to advance Canada's economic interests, but as a way to advance its own political and ideological objectives. Those objectives have sent off-putting signals to some of our key trade partners who are not as advanced in their understanding of human rights, gender equality, and the rule of law, in turn jeopardizing those important relationships. Publicly berating the Prime Minister of Italy at the recent G7 summit about her country's position on gay rights changed nothing in that country, but it sure put a damper on our relations with that country. Our Prime Minister's first trip to India, well, we know how that played out. Sadly, the second trip wasn't much better. But that relationship has recently gone completely off the rails. Our government's allegations of Indian government involvement in the assassination of a Canadian citizen, and India's pre-existing allegations that Canada continues to harbor Khalistani terrorists have badly strained our relations with this important trade partner. In fact, last week, India removed diplomatic immunity from 41 Canadians working at our missions in India, forcing them to leave that country in haste. Consular, visa, and immigration services will all be curtailed, impacting students, workers, families, businesses, and travelers. Trade restrictions will undoubtedly follow, hurting even more Canadians, including our pulse producers. An early harvest free trade agreement, almost certainly off the table. And then there's China. The mishandling of the house arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the two Michaels, foreign election interference, and then the serious breach of protocol following a behind closed doors meeting between President Xi and our Prime Minister, all have soured our relationship with our second largest trade partner. As a consequence, the government's much vaunted Indo-Pacific strategy appears to be in tatters and in need of radical surgery. Can you imagine an Indo-Pacific strategy without China or India? Saudi Arabia is another case in point. That relationship was placed in a deep freeze because of ill-considered actions and unhelpful comments by our country's leadership. Now, obviously, none of our trade partners have perfect records on issues such as human rights, democracy, the environment, or the rule of law. From time to time, even Canada falls short on that account. Now, to be clear, Canada should always be a strong champion and defender of those rights. But Canadian values must be promoted with tactful diplomacy in keeping with Canada's erstwhile reputation as a trusted soft power and with a view to promoting Canada's broader economic and geopolitical interests. I'm reminded of the maxim, don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. Trade at its very essence is about promoting Canada's economic self-interest. And that means promoting our commercial interests around the world in an assertive yet winsome way. And as I mentioned, by promoting those trade interests effectively, we create new opportunities to share our own best practices on issues such as democracy, freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. That's a beneficial consequence of engaging respectfully with other nations. But it's not the primary objective of trade. Virtue signaling on the world stage will do nothing to enhance job creation and trade-related activity at home or improve our standing on the world stage. So, as we promote our values and share our best practices in these areas, we must equally reestablish trust with our trading partners. And that will require a change in engagement strategy. Meanwhile, all of this uncertainty is happening at a time when our biggest trade partner, the US, has become increasingly protectionist. Case in point, Canada's failure to secure a renewal of the soft lumber agreement. Almost 8 years ago, our Prime Minister visited then President Obama at the White House and emerged giving Canadians an assurance that the two leaders had agreed to a framework to resolve the dispute in short order. And we're still waiting. Why? May I suggest, perhaps trade in the era of Trump. The election of President Donald Trump in 2016 had immediate consequences for Canada as the new president abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though the original premise of that negotiation had been to create a US-led counterweight to the economic influence of China within the Asia-Pacific region. Under Trump and now President Biden, America has turned inward, ushering in a more self-centered and mercenary approach to US foreign and trade policy. And of course, the most obvious example of this was Trump's obsession with renegotiating NAFTA. What began as threats from Trump to tear up NAFTA if Canada didn't come to the table with serious concessions ended up with our Prime Minister acquiescing and then returning with a lesser agreement than we had before, contrary to the public promises he had made. And the newly signed USMCA, or CUSMA, left a number of outstanding trade irritants like softwood lumber and Buy America unresolved. It turns out that the threat of tearing up NAFTA was actually never a serious option because such an act would have required congressional approval. So think about it. You have 30 of the American states having Canada as their #1 export destination. Think about the representatives and the governors and the senators and the vested business interests that would have screamed bloody murder had managed trade been put at risk by such a reckless act. So it wasn't going to happen. But Trump's bluff did pay off. They got the agreement they wanted. And under Trump, we also saw the U.S. emasculate the World Trade Organization by refusing to appoint members to its dispute resolution appellate body. This body is essential to ensuring that the WTO's members respect and comply with the rules of international trade. And just as concerning is the increasing willingness of the BRICS countries, led by China and India, to block consensus on negotiations to keep the WTO rules current, such as those regarding electronic commerce, digital commerce. This obstruction is slowing down efforts to harness the benefits of liberalized trade and to take advantage of the opportunities we have to raise people out of poverty and improve economic outcomes within a globalized world. Now, the troubling conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East are also certain to exacerbate the unwillingness of countries to stick their necks out to eliminate their own tariff and non-tariff barriers. Similarly, the reemergence of populist and nationalist movements around the world is creating additional pressure to resist trade liberalization. And just as important is the inclination of many developed economies to reduce their supply chain dependency on China and on other hostile regimes, particularly through protectionist domestic subsidies and industrial policies. This will potentially set back trade liberalization efforts and the relevance of the WTO. But lest you include me among the pessimists, let me just say to those who lament the world's retreat from economic multilateralism, history shows that we've always had bilateral and regional trade agreements competing and coexisting with the multilateral system. What is new and different is the advent of coalitions of partners on specific subjects or sectors, like-mindedness in the name of economic security. Examples would include Canada's membership in more than one critical minerals network, or the high standards of the New Zealand-Singapore-inspired Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, or the EU-US Green Steel Initiative that would lower tariffs on imports of steel from non-coal burning sources, a not-so-subtle shot at China. So we're operating in a more complex rule-making environment, and Canada needs to be adept at choosing its tables and helping to shape and not just take the rules set by others. So, where does Canada go from here? Let me make 8 suggestions. First, the reality is that the global trade landscape continues to shift and evolve, often in unexpected and uncontrollable ways. What is in our control are the trade relationships we choose to prioritize based on our own economic interests and values. The Indo-Pacific strategy was such an effort by Global Affairs Canada to reflect that where our values and economic interests lie today may be quite different than where they used to reside. Although the badly fractured relationship with India has set back that effort, the principle of pivoting towards our most like-minded partners remains sound. Our pivot towards Japan through the CPTPP is reflective of such a strategic pivot. More broadly, by most accounts, the CPTPP is working well and reflects both our values and economic self-interest. And that principle of like-mindedness should cause us to consider whether countries like Taiwan or the Philippines should be added to our TPP family. Now, more challenging is our engagement with ASEAN, which is that alliance of Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Philippines. Although this region of the world remains the world's most dynamic, its members generally are not fully aligned with our Prime Minister's progressive ideology. Negotiations on liberalized trade with this bloc of countries and a separate bilateral negotiation with Indonesia, which is ongoing, will require superior agility and flexibility and a healthy dose of pragmatism to achieve a successful conclusion. Second, we cannot afford to virtue signal on the environment and impair our ability to export our desperately needed resources to willing purchasers who will otherwise secure those supplies elsewhere, often from producers whose environmental performance and ethical conduct pale in comparison to ours. We can and should ensure that international trading rules on carbon pricing, carbon border adjustments, and carbon leakage support rather than hinder a global energy transition. And contrary to the government's assertions, there is a compelling case to be made for entering into long-term supply agreements for the sale of Canada's LNG to like-minded partners such as Germany, France, and Japan. Similarly, our Southeast Asian partners are imploring us to do the same for their energy security. It is in our national interest to facilitate the replacement of coal-fired thermal plants around the world by exporting our ethically produced natural gas. This serves both our environmental and economic interests. So stop apologizing for our oil and gas sector. The time for prevarication over the value of our providential endowments must end. Our country has been blessed with an abundance of natural resources, and it is irresponsible to hoard and strand those resources when both our trade and environmental objectives demand that they be shared with willing customers around the world. Third, we need a fresh approach to our engagement with the U.S., by far our largest trade and investment partner and our most trusted ally. This is particularly important now, with a U.S. presidential election looming and a required review of CUSMA rapidly approaching in 2026. You know, too often we shoot ourselves in the foot. Recent domestic policy developments in Canada are certain to arouse the ire of our American cousins, including policies on supply management and the regulation of digital platforms, news content, and content creators. Similarly, the digital services tax on social media platforms and online marketplaces will not in any way endear us to the U.S. As I mentioned earlier, Canada's recent retreat from its defense spending commitment reinforces the perception amongst our allies in NORAD and NATO that our country cannot be trusted to follow through on its promises. We shouldn't be surprised then when Canada isn't asked to join the recently formed AUKUS defense partnership, and I get that it's a submarine and nuclear-focused partnership, but the fact that we weren't even approached, or the Quad, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and one might ask why Canada wasn't asked to participate in the joint statement on the Israel-Hamas war issued by 5 of our 7 G7 partners. It's hard not to draw the conclusion that an unserious and unreliable Canada remains isolated on the global stage and from its most important security partner. I believe we can and must do better. Fourth, Canada needs to restore and bolster its leadership at the WTO. While the formation of the so-called Ottawa Group of middle powers to support WTO reform was laudable, unfortunately, that forum failed to attract broader support. New efforts are needed to build consensus on a forward-looking negotiation agenda. As it is, Canada's voice is no longer as valued at this forum as it once was. Fifth, we must recognize that economic security is national security. Everything from critical minerals and commodities to high technologies. This new complexity demands that we work with the U.S. and other like-minded partners to define, as U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan put it, the, quote, high fences and the size of the small yard that needs protection, end quote. This would encompass everything from trade, investment, and supply chain resiliency to emerging challenges such as cyber, research and academic exchanges, quantum computing, and AI. Sixth, as successful trade liberalization is premised upon the principle of comparative advantage, we may need to take another look at where Canada's advantages lie. This will inform how we negotiate market access commitments in the future and which goods and services we most actively promote through our Trade Commissioner's service. Seventh, how many of you in this room can name Canada's trade minister? You can. Yeah, okay, yes. Who? No. It's Mary Ng, right? So, therein lies the problem. Canada's Minister of Trade must again be given a leading voice around the cabinet table as one of the most important economic portfolios within the Prime Minister's inner circle. Only with this type of commitment will trade again become a linchpin in Canada's overall prosperity agenda. And lastly, and then I'll conclude, although our most trusted trade partners may not presently include less hospitable actors, China and India, as the world's two most populous countries and economic powerhouses in their own right, these two giants cannot be ignored. We do so at our own economic peril. Since Canada had planned to undertake a pivot in our preferred trade partners under the Indo-Pacific strategy, we could just as easily consider a pivot away from the failed engagement strategies of the recent past and towards a more robust and clear-eyed economic diplomacy that is rooted in strength, maturity, resolve, trust, and respect, and perhaps a reasonable dose of pragmatism. I'm confident that with the appropriate caution and a better understanding of what can be accomplished, by harnessing the ingenuity and professionalism of our diplomatic corps and trade professionals, we can rebuild the bridges of relationship with China and India and with the other partners from whom we have been alienated. How do I know this can work? Because we've done it before, and we can do it again. Now, will there be challenges? Of course. Trade is like a great adventure in Canada's wilderness areas. My daughters and I spent many summers hiking for weeks on end through Canada's backwoods and forests, whether it's the Skyline Trail, the West Coast Trail, the Bowron Lakes, the Chilkoot Trail up out of Alaska. And you know, the journey is always exhausting. You never quite know what's around the corner. There will be unanticipated setbacks and disappointments, bumps and bruises along the way. From time to time, you might even lose your way and require a course correction. But there will also be great vistas to take in, peaceful times of reflection, great cardio workouts, and deeply satisfying team-building experiences. And when you finally arrive at your destination, photos in hand, you look back with exhilaration and recognize that the journey was truly worth it. Mel, I look forward to our discussion.
You sound like a Cunard Lines advertisement. Getting there is half the fun.
I thought you were going to call me a car salesman.
No. I've got about 12 questions. I've got one from the audience. Please fill out the cards and submit them. The 12 questions are from me. But let's start with one of the issues you've raised is having a trade policy that's consistent with our values and consistent with our interests. And you said actually equally. And I'm wondering, is there a hierarchy here? How do you identify, and I think we would agree that performative virtue signaling is not going to help either values or interests. So how do you advance the Canada's interests or values?
Well, first of all, remember, we will have a hierarchy perhaps here in Canada, but our trading partners also have their own hierarchy. And when those two clash, it requires great skill and diplomacy to try to find that fine point where you can come to consensus. And let me give you an example. I mentioned a number of high-profile cases where perhaps Canada didn't quite act or pursue effective diplomacy. when meeting with other heads of state. I will tell you that when I was traveling with Prime Minister Harper, he was very intent on promoting Canada's value system. I remember meetings with President Xi, with Putin, with Modi, and once the main session was finished, typically you've got, officials arrayed sort of in a V, and then you've got the two leaders sitting across from each other with a big potted plant in the middle. I think you understand what that's like.
Yeah.
You've been there. And once that discussion is finished, the Prime Minister would lean over to the other leader and say, Mr. So-and-so, say President Xi, do you mind if we have a private moment? I'll keep my trade minister with me, you keep your chief of staff. I just wanted to have a discussion with you. So everybody would leave, the media would leave, and then we'd have a very frank discussion about human rights, about the rule of law, consular issues that were sensitive. And at the end of the day, we kept our relationship with that leader and with that country intact by being tactful and winsome in how we pursued our value system.
So let me go to one of the questions from the floor, and it's the need for tactical diplomacy. You've just described what goes on inside the room and what goes on in front of the cameras. How do you insist on advancing those interests, and what are the other instruments of tactical diplomacy?
Tactical or tactful?
You could go with whatever you like. It was tactical, but
tactical. It may have been intended to be tactful because that's
quite
what I
some.
used.
Yeah.
Well, I think when we're working with our allies around the world and countries that are not our allies, I think the best way of pursuing tactful diplomacy is to understand that every country has its own history of failures, of embarrassments, of shame. We do in Canada. And some of those countries have a more recent history in terms of wanting to emerge from those troubled histories. I think you've got to give them a little bit of slack. And one of the ways you can do that is by building into trade agreements robust aspirational language rather than firm commitments that the other side could never commit to. Use aspiration. And you can follow up on that aspirational commitment by having or scheduling regular fora in which these are discussed. And that happens actually with our trade agreements where even if you've got an existing trade agreement, there are regular meetings between officials from both countries to talk about what's going well with the agreement, what's not going well. And that can include some of this aspirational value language that eventually then becomes baked into the fabric of that other country.
That leads to one of the questions from the floor about the Canada-Korea free trade agreement. And the question is, how would you appraise it now? Has it been successful?
Yes. The Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement, by the way, we have some Koreans here today, right? Who in the washroom said, oh, you're Ed Fast. You're the guy who did the Korea Free Trade Agreement. And I said, yes. It wasn't me. It was a team, right?
Yeah.
It's a team that negotiates. But that agreement has been warmly welcomed on both sides of the Pacific. I was there just 6 months ago, and we were promoting the value of that agreement and also the fact that South Korea has become a truly robust democracy when it's surrounded by countries, that may not appreciate our democratic ideals.
So there happens to be a Canada-Korea colloquium going on right now in Seoul.
Wonderful.
But anyway,
Yeah.
You raised both multilateral versus bilateral and regional agreements. I was just upstairs in the Sylvia Austri boardroom, and Sylvia was the Deputy Minister of Trade under Brian Mulroney, negotiated one of the last multilateral free trade agreements. And the question is really, what what is the future? And are we finished with multilateral, like fully global free trade agreements, WTO-based free trade agreements, and we're relegated to either bilateral or regional agreements?
That is a great question, because there are many people that have lamented the fact that we have retreated from multilateralism and have now preferred to engage in bilaterals, plurilaterals, regional agreements. And the WTO it's almost dying on the vine. I mentioned one of the reasons, which is Donald Trump. I think he had an intention to emasculate the WTO because he saw it as being adverse to American interests. I would posit that, in fact, quite the opposite is true. The WTO has been a valuable tool for the United States to promote freer, liberalized trade around the world. Right now, multilateralism is in a very difficult spot. And I don't know if there's a quick fix to it, because guess who's around the corner? Maybe Donald Trump again, right? And when you look at the polls, you never know how Americans are going to vote. And it may be Donald Trump against President Biden again. And if Trump becomes president, you can expect an even more assertive, inward-looking, mercenary approach to foreign relations and trade.
Hasn't there been a bit of a role reversal where the Democrats in the U.S. were typically the protectionists,
Yes.
and the Republicans were more traditionally internationalists?
Yes, in fact, if you go back to the original TPP negotiations, which, by the way, wound up in 2015, right in the middle of our federal election. It was very awkward for me because I had to travel to Atlanta to finalize negotiations. President Obama was very anxious to get that deal done. He's a Democrat, but very bullish on getting that free trade agreement done. But of course, Donald Trump saw an advantage there, probably a political advantage, and said, not a chance, I'm going to pull the US out of TPP. And he became so bellicose that eventually Hillary Clinton followed suit and said, you know what, I'm going to pull out too if I become president. It's very unfortunate that politics got in the way of common sense. The TPP truly was intended to be a counterweight to China. Yes. And it would be American-led, where we set the rules of trade within that dynamic region. The U.S. is now, in a way, absent.
So, are you a globalist? I want to preface that question by saying the former President Trump called Tom Emmer, the previous candidate for House Speaker, a globalist, as if he was calling him a criminal.
Yeah.
Are you a globalist?
Well, let me say this. Globalism and globalization are two different things. There's a clear distinction between the two. When we talk about trade, we're talking about trade within a globalized world. And globalization is a reality. It's not something we can push back on, because globalization happens because we are more and more linked together as humanity. Countries are more and more linked together through technology. We can't escape that. So globalization is a reality. I don't want to get into a debate over globalism, because you get into conspiracy theories and all the stuff that is not helpful in promoting Canada's trade agenda.
Agreed. One of the things you did mention was supply management, and I've got to tell you that's one of my great bugaboos. I resent my grandchildren having milk products that subsidize farmers. However, the House has just recently passed a
C-282.
prohibition
Yes.
on negotiating on dairy policy. Defend that for us.
I don't have to defend it because I voted against the bill.
Good for you.
Okay?
I'll defend you
So
then.
now we're on the same page. Bill C-282 basically put into law that the government of Canada will not put supply management, that includes dairy, chicken, turkeys, eggs, will not put the supply managed sector on the table in future trade negotiations. It's the only sector of our economy that has received that preferential treatment. No other industry gets that treatment. Having been on the other side of the negotiating tables for trade, I know how disadvantageous it is if you've got folks on the other side who are saying, well, you know, we've got to find quid pro quos that are going to make this work, and you've taken a good chunk of your negotiating ability off the table. And that's especially important when it comes to the United States. And we have a renegotiation coming up on CUSMA a couple of years hence. So I actually voted against this bill in the House. By the way, in Abbotsford, my home community, supply management is huge. In fact, we're probably the most supply managed community in British Columbia.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
In Ontario, there's a few areas too.
And Quebec.
Yeah, in Quebec, of course. But I just could not bring myself to vote in favor of a bill that was adverse to Canada's long-term economic interests. I just couldn't do it. Sorry, Mel.
No, I thought I had you, but I didn't.
No, I've borne the brunt of some of these folks. But I
must have
explained to
resonated with your constituents.
well, sure, but I've explained to them, listen, when you sent me to Ottawa 18 years ago, did you want me to promote Canada's interest or just one interest alone? And they all agree, well, you should be promoting Canada's interest. They will then say, well, it's in Canada's interest that we not put that on the table, right? And I've got arguments for that too, but...
Let me open up a little lightning round because there have been quite a few questions which are country specific. So very quickly, Japan. What should Mary Ng do next week when she's in Japan?
I think she should be sitting down and saying, listen, we are open to selling you natural gas, entering into these long-term supply agreements. I know what Japan's response would be. Where have you been?
Okay. India. Things are calming down a bit. They've started to process visas again. What should we do to strengthen the trade relationship? And is it possible to do that now?
Well, can I be political here?
You already have it. Go ahead.
Well, it's the only answer that I have available.
Good.
I don't know how the current government salvages its relationship with Prime Minister Modi. You know, he's a tough guy. You know, in a different setting, he might be a strong man. He's very strong. And boy, I tell you, if you cross him, likely it's going to impair your relationship for a long, long time. So I would say, you know, a change in government probably would make a big difference. I mean that sincerely. I don't think the India relationship will
You're
be
suggesting a
restored.
Jagmeet Singh government? No. Let me guess, not.
No.
Let's do Taiwan. Should Taiwan join CPTPP?
Yes.
That was pretty clear. Okay. How do you get there?
How do you get there? Well, you're going to have to bring all of the other 11 CPTPP partners along. That is no mean task. It's going to be very difficult to persuade all the partners to welcome Taiwan because China will, of course, be making all kinds of noises. You know, a bellicose, belligerent China tries to stand in the way of more progressive countries asserting their trade values and asserting their trade interests within the Asia-Pacific region.
Let's go back to your GMAP, the Global Market Action Plan. Give me a sense of the requirements and the balance between strategy and action plan. Your 8 enumerated items were sort of a mix of both a strategic focus,
Yes.
but we should do this.
Yes.
How do you balance, I mean, from a minister's perspective, if you ever become trade minister again, and you've given us a sense of what your priorities would be, how do you balance out the need for a strategic focus, but something with your head in the clouds and feet on the ground, an action plan?
Well, strategic focus has built into it strategy. And I have not been a critic of the Indo-Pacific strategy. I feel that Global Affairs did a good job in articulating what that strategy should look like. The execution of this strategy, which you've just referenced, the action plan, is a little different and requires tact. It requires winsomeness. It requires repeated engagement with your counterparts in your partner country. As I mentioned, I was the most traveled trade minister, and I just traveled around the world meeting with my colleagues around the world so that when we had a problem, say canola, and the blackleg problem with China, right? I could go call up the Minister of Trade, or Economic Affairs as they call him, and we could sit down and resolve it, and we did. But that requires sustained engagement with your counterparts. And I'm not sure I'm seeing that to the level that there used to be.
So let's push that just a bit. I'd like you to riff a bit on the notion of these personal relationships. You've talked about this as country to country. How important is it that you can pick up the phone and call Buggins, who happens to be the minister of this and that? Talk about those personal relationships.
Very, very important. Probably the most important job, at least of a trade minister, is to have, first of all, the respect of his prime minister and his caucus and his cabinet, and the trust of stakeholders that he deals with. But it's also just as important for him to have a relationship of trust with his counterparts around the world. I'll give you an example. When I was first appointed, one of my first meetings was with Tim Grosser, who is the trade minister for New Zealand. And we were at some multilateral event, and he says, "Fast, why don't you come up to the hotel room afterwards? We'll have a drink. I just want to get to know you." So I go in there, unawares, and he closes the door, and he sticks his finger in my chest and says, "I hope that you're not like some of the other people I've had to deal with who are constantly thinking that they know everything about trade when they actually don't." And I said, "I'm sorry, I don't know who you're talking about, but you know what? I think you're going to find me to be a respectful, well-informed person you can engage with. You will also find I'm not a pushover," and I never was. And our negotiators aren't. But immediately, we developed a rapport, and Tim and I had a great relationship. And we've been in touch since, too.
That's great.
Yeah.
You mentioned Jonathan Freed, and now you've talked about the negotiators. What's your assessment of the strengths in the public service of Canada that deal with trade issues? Because the largest trade department is the Department of International Trade, but the second largest is agriculture.
Yes.
And they're not as interested in free trade as some people might want.
That's true.
So what's your sense of the government public service?
They're the best in the world. Our trade negotiators, if you want to hone in exactly on what we're talking about, our trade negotiators are considered the very best in the world. Now, a lot of them have retired or have been moved on to other positions. Like Kirsten Hillman is now our ambassador to the United States. Steve Verhul has retired. I think Don Stephenson has retired. Jonathan Freed has retired, who's a good friend.
These are people with gray beards, but carry on.
They are. They all have gray. But when they engaged abroad and negotiated, for example, you were at the WTO, negotiators from other countries, developing countries, who just didn't have the capacity to negotiate properly, they would come up to our negotiators, Canadian negotiators, because they trusted them. They trusted Canada. And they would say, "Hey, do you mind giving us a little bit of advice on how we should negotiate with the US? And, how do we deal with this chapter and this chapter?" And invariably, our negotiators would share some of their best practices and some of their knowledge with countries who desperately needed it. That's why Canada had this stellar reputation around the world as being, a kinder, gentler partner to work with because they all respected us. And of course, that allowed us then at the WTO when we need to marshal troops to support some of the, market rule changes we wanted to make, say at the Doha round in Bali or wherever it was. And we could marshal those folks to support us and support the United States, right? To get some outcomes that really furthered our liberalization objectives at the WTO.
You mentioned carbon border adjustment measures. Is that possible for Canada, or is the only way that that could happen through the Dubai, the next conference of the parties?
Of the parties, the COP parties.
In the COP, yeah.
That would have to be done through COP, simply because that is the forum that is now tasked with establishing the rules under which greenhouse gas emissions will be regulated. Now, I do know that the UNFCCC,
The Framework Convention on
yes,
Climate Change.
on climate change, has established some rules, I think it's under Chapter 6 of the Paris Agreement, to allow countries to share carbon credits, which I feel may be a way for Canada to export its more ethical natural gas, cleaner gas, to countries that want to convert from coal-fired to natural gas. And Canada would receive some credits for that.
Right.
So I welcome that. Whether our government will take up that opportunity, I don't know. But in terms of what we can do at our borders, it is possible for tariffs and duties to be used to ensure that carbon leakage doesn't take place. Basically what we're talking about is that if a country like Germany or Canada has businesses that are being held to very high environmental standards, they could very well ship their operations off to a more polluting environment where the regulations aren't as strict. They could produce the same goods, export them to Canada and get them into Canada, and now we've frustrated the goals of the UNFCCC and the world community. And getting a grip of that challenge is frustrating. I think the WTO does have a role to play in that.
So I would argue that at the point we have a carbon pricing mechanism in Canada at this point, we don't need desperately a carbon border adjustment mechanism. But if we go to where we plan to go, we are going to need some kind of adjustment.
Yes, and remember, I'm from the party that is axe the tax, right?
I'm
of
trying to
that,
draw you out gently.
yeah, some of that carbon pricing may be gone. It won't all be gone because, as you know, we have many of the provinces have their own regimes in place, which are carbon pricing, usually on the large emitters. But there are going to have to be some adjustments down the road, and that's why I think the whole issue of carbon border adjustments is still a live issue in Canada.
Okay. I want to bring you back to values and ethics. One of the online questioners says, is there a way to, what are your thoughts on imposing constraints through legislation on issues related to forced or child labor and supply chains, et cetera? Do you see this as something that Parliament should deal with?
Through
legislation.
Legislation?
Yeah. Like limiting or
Yes.
endorsing positions? Or
Absolutely. In fact, when it comes to child labor, labor in general, most of our trade agreements, even the ones with less developed countries, have some pretty robust provisions in them that address that.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you haven't talked about, the P word didn't come up in your talk, and that's provinces. I would argue, and you lived it, so I don't have to explain this to you, but for everybody else, it's although trade and commerce is a federal head of power, is very limiting for the federal government to do more than take the lead, because you need the provinces to come along
Yes.
on things like procurement and other things.
You're
Do you
right.
want to just riff on what the state of affairs will be in Canada over the next few years relating to federal, provincial collaboration and cooperation on trade agreements?
Great question, because during my 4.5 years as minister, one of the most surprising things I found was how pro-trade every single province was, including Quebec. You know, Quebec is often seen as, the province that always tries to thwart consensus and all that. That's not the case when it comes to trade. I mean, they had a government that was adverse to most of the things we were doing under Stephen Harper, but when it came to trade, they were great champions, and it was that way across the country. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't have some tough negotiations. I remember some with Newfoundland, which in the end were resolved in a timely way, but they were a little bit acrimonious until both sides saw, hey, there is a way forward here. And all of us benefit from enhanced trade opportunities.
So trade could be the thing that brings feds and provinces together.
I didn't say that.
Okay.
That's maybe a bridge too far,
Okay,
because
probably.
we could talk about interprovincial trade barriers, and that's an intractable issue.
Quite so. You did mention in one of your 8 items national security. And one of the areas where Canada has in the past caused some controversy has been in the export of munitions and weapons, and even arguably lavs that have been
To
used.
Saudi Arabia.
I was trying to
Yemen.
avoid mentioning Saudi Arabia. So the question is, how do you see trade and national security going together?
I think that's where our value system comes into play. And Saudi Arabia is an interesting case in point, right? You didn't want to mention Saudi Arabia, but I think it's certainly
It's
on public record
Quite so.
as having purchased many Canadian-built LAVs, which are among the best LAVs in the world.
Light armored vehicles.
Yes, light armored vehicles. The allegation is that Saudi Arabia uses those against their own citizens, right? Or is using them in conflicts like in Yemen.
Right.
I think there we have to be very careful. I mean, we authorized the sale of those under the previous government, and the current government carried that on. But that also led to a break in relationship between Canada and Saudi Arabia, as you know. And I understand that relationship is slowly being restored, which is good. But we have to be very, very careful. This is a world in which Canada's values do have to manifest themselves in our trade agreements. And sometimes we have to be pragmatic. There are times when I think we have to simply stick with our principles and say, hey, you know what? We're going to have to remain firm here. So, when we reconsider this back then, when that deal was approved, Saudi Arabia, we weren't aware the degree to which perhaps the LAVs would be used for other purposes.
Right.
We were advised they were to be used strictly for defensive purposes.
So we have a bilateral relationship or agreement with the United States on defense procurement. And you talked about Buy America as one of the dangers of a Trump presidency. Those are my words, not yours. But talk about Buy America and what can Canada do? We've got CUSMA, we have the defense procurement agreement, but what else should we be doing to prepare for the Trump presidency?
Well, Buy America, as you know, is the United States preferring its own businesses as business partners rather than opening up procurement to a much larger range of businesses. So when the United States decides to purchase a fighter jet, it's not going to come to Canada. It makes sense for them to buy it from Boeing or from General Dynamics or whoever, right? Or Lockheed. But many of the products that the American government buys could easily be procured in Canada. But the industrial policy of the United States is there are certain goods that we're going to only allow to be purchased in the United States. It's a preference. It is protectionist. It's very clearly protectionist. But then Canada doesn't have clean hands. I mean, we've got supply management. We have other protectionist policies. They think our softwood lumber pricing system is offside with free trade, right? So each country has its sacred cows that it looks to protect. And I guess we have to work our way through that. Along the way, over the years, there have been little concessions made by the U.S. in terms of addressing our concerns about Buy America. We've been able to negotiate away some of those provisions, but they're still very willing to do that to prevent Canadian business from competing fairly within the North American marketplace.
As a former Minister of Trade Promotion, and you talked about Canadian companies, to what extent can the government help? Is there a role for government in helping Canadian SMEs become prepared for export?
Yes. Our Trade Commissioner Service is expressly tasked to help Canadian companies penetrate new export markets.
But most of them are positioned abroad. And do we need a Trade Commissioner Service in Canada?
Actually, we do have a Trade Commissioner Service in Canada, in a number of cities across Canada. Certainly in Vancouver we do.
Yeah, and in Toronto.
Yeah, in Toronto. Could we use more across the country? You know, as years go by, I know the Trade Commissioner does a reassessment. To what degree will an office, say in Winnipeg or in Edmonton or perhaps in Halifax, what difference will it make? Sometimes they'll open these offices and then close them because the amount of business they're doing just doesn't justify it. But there are other tools. We've got the Trade Commissioner Service, which is all over the world. Like we have lots of these offices. In China, I think we have 14
Really? Yeah.
trade offices. Most of them were open under Harbour, but I can see that, you know, with some of the fiscal pressures facing government, they may be tempted to close some of them, especially given our eroding relationship with China. But there's other tools as well. We have the Canadian Commercial Corporation, which is focused on government-to-government procurement, and they step in. They can act as almost like a guarantor for another country to purchase products, often on the procurement side. We have the EDC, Export Development Corporation, which is tasked expressly to provide financing to export-oriented businesses that are looking to penetrate new markets.
Yeah, I think the real challenge is getting them ready to penetrate those markets, and that there's still a fair bit of work to be done there.
There is.
You mentioned the FIPA with China and the investment promotion, and you surprised me when you said it took 18 years to sort of prepare that. How do you deal with these long time horizons of building relationships that you talked about? And CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the EU, also took 15, 20 years. How, if I recall, I mean, this government and the next government and the one before and the one after will always have a 4 or 5 year time horizon. How do you ensure that 18-year time period is going to be able to be addressed?
It's true that negotiations often take many years, although not 18 years. That was an exception, and it was China.
Yeah.
But CETA was started early in our term, probably around 2015. I mean, you were around in
Well-
the transition period, so you would know.
Roy McLaren would say that he was the minister who started it, but back in the Chrétien government.
Listen,
Yeah.
I don't want to be guilty of stolen
No,
valor.
no.
But,
You brought it to fruition. That was important.
well, you know,
You
but-
started the serious negotiations.
Yes, we did. However, it was the current government that actually signed the agreement, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And it took years for the individual EU states to ratify every single one of those.
And it came this close, if I recall,
Yes.
from Chrystia Freeland.
Yes. Now there's 26 members left, right? It used to be 27, and then Brexit took
Yeah.
the UK out. But those 26, every single country had to ratify. And they all have their little irritant that they want to address, right? So they'll come back and we'll say no, and they'll come back and say, but then we're going to thwart, getting this agreement into force, and you make accommodations, but at the end of the day, it got done and it's being used.
But you do need to have that long-term,
Long-term,
over the horizon
And the good
perspective.
thing is, in Canada's history, there have only been two parties that have ever governed. And ironically, the early conservative government in Macdonald was actually anti-free trade, right?
Interesting,
Yeah. But the modern conservative movement is very bullish on trade. And the Liberal Party is as well. So even though, we fight amongst ourselves in the House of Commons during question period, when it comes to trade, there's a general consensus that trade is good for Canada. And when we negotiate a trade agreement and it isn't fully signed off by the time the new government comes in, it's not a problem, and vice versa. And I believe the Liberals usually vote in favor of free trade, and we do. And once or twice the NDP has voted in favor of trade. I think it was Jordan, our free trade agreement with Jordan. Who knows why they voted in favor?
Take it to the bank when you can. One of the things I recall in the transition from the Mulroney government to the Chrétien government was that it was actually Chrétien that signed NAFTA,
Yes.
but because it was like a week after the election, but of course had no contact with the U.S. in preparation
Yes.
for it. So that consistency is really important, I
Yes.
think.
I mean, politics sometimes comes into play. I think the election of 1993 was fought partly on free trade, and I believe Chrétien said, I'm going to tear it up. And,
And he ended up signing it.
Oh, yeah, cooler heads prevail.
That's right.
And I believe that also happened in 1988.
Well, 88 was the free trade agreement.
Yes, the
election,
first
for
one,
sure.
the Canada-US.
Yes.
And I believe the
Custom.
same thing happened
Custom.
there.
Yeah, exactly right. So the last question I'll put to you is from an online student. Some of the students here at the Munk School could someday be working with our future leaders who might establish these new trade agreements you speak of.
Mm-hmm.
If you could give one piece of advice to these future leaders, what would it be?
My advice would be choose trade. It is arguably the most dynamic space within global affairs that you possibly be engaged in. It'll take you all around the world. It will challenge your policy skills. It's going to allow you to build some amazing relationships around the world and within Canada. So I'm a big fan of mentoring the next generation of leaders. Two of my former staff members are now MPs. A third one is the Minister of Labour right here in Ontario. Others have gone on to careers in trade, in law, of course. So mentoring that next generation of leader to understand that trade is important, Canada's values are important, but promoting those values within a trade environment has to be done in a tactful and winsome way. I would give them that advice.
That's good advice. Let me now just thank you for taking the time to spend an hour and a half with us and maybe some more. It's been great to hear from a practitioner, but a practitioner who has a very thoughtful and comprehensive approach to how to deal with one of those issues that's fundamental to the future of Canada. And so thanks for being here, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you.